Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, Chapter 1. Anatomy is a branch of science that deals with the structure or morphology of body parts, their forms, and how they are organized. An investigator who conducts experiments to determine how the size of the skull is in proportion to the rest of the body would be an anatomist. They observe body parts. Physiology, on the other hand, concerns with the function of these body parts, what they do and how they do it. An investigator who conducts experiments to determine how the rate at which the heart beats as it is affected by body temperature changes is most likely a physiologist. They study the function of the body parts, the function of the human body. Structure is always related to function. Now, before we go on into our study of the human body, we need to look at the levels of organization of the body. The structural and functional unit of all living things is the cell. So since we are talking about the cell a bit, we're going to have to talk about the cell theory. Now, the cell theory states that, yes, the cell is the basic structure and functional unit of all living things. The whole organism is dependent upon individual and collective activities of cells. Continuation of life is dependent upon the reproduction of cells. New cells must be made so that they can replace worn and dying cells. The cell, again, is the smallest living thing which displays all the characteristics of life. Now, cells are organized into increasingly more complex levels. But before we can really talk about the cell, we have to talk about what the cell is made out of. The basic structural unit of all things in the world, all matter, is the atom. So all living and non-living things is made up of atoms. Now, two or more atoms together form a molecule. And then you'll have molecules coming together to form more complex molecules, and these are called macromolecules. Some examples of macromolecules would be like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. Those are just examples. DNA would be another example of a macromolecule. Now, an organelle is a structure that has macromolecules that are working together for a specific function. And organelles can be found inside a cell. Several different types of organelles are found within cells. Now, a cell is interesting in that a cell can be a skin cell or a bone cell or a neuron, a brain cell, but what makes them different from one another? First off, you have to know that in the nucleus of a cell you have DNA, and that genetic material contains all the information for a whole new you, for a whole new human. So we could take a cell from any part of your body that has a nucleus, and if we could activate the genetic materials inside that cell, we could grow a whole new you. But what makes a cell a skin cell, or a bone cell, or a neuron, or a blood cell? It is that a certain portion of that genetic information is turned on while the rest of it is not. So it makes the cell a specific type of cell. Well, these cells come together to form tissues, and tissues may have several different types of cells, and then tissues come together to form an organ system, and then organism. So cells are organized into increasingly more complex levels. Let's talk about homeostasis. We need to know that we have a constant internal environment. Things need to stay at a particular pH, a particular temperature. Now, temperature remains the same throughout the body for the most part, but pH may be different in the mouth than it is in the stomach, than it is in the intestines. So pH will vary from place to place. Temperature remains the same. Okay, let's talk about homeostasis and a homeostatic mechanism. The first example we'll look at here is the one that keeps a constant internal temperature. Okay, for homeostasis, you need some parts that will indicate whether or not the thermoreceptors are receptors that signal the control center when you have deviation from set point. Now, the set point here is 98.6 Fahrenheit, but in science we usually use the metric, which would be Celsius, and that would be 37 degrees. That's our normal body temperature or set point. Now, some people vary a little bit by 1/10 of a degree, but normally most everybody has a set point of 37 degrees Celsius. That's normal. Our system uses negative feedback to signal the control center whenever there is a deviation. There are receptors, then you have the control center, and then effectors. Receptors for temperature, we call those thermoreceptors. You have thermoreceptors in the skin, you have thermoreceptors in different parts of the body. But these thermoreceptors will signal the control center, the hypothalamus in the brain, in this case, detects a deviation from set point of our body temperature, and it will signal the effector organs. Well, the effector organs have a specific job in trying to reestablish that set point or the norm. We have effectors that will respond to a deviation from set points in our skin, and the skin blood vessels will dilate, and that's why you become red in the face, and then your sweat glands will secrete and release moisture. In response, the body heat is lost to the surroundings by the evaporation of that sweat, and the temperature returns to normal. Now, as that sweat evaporates, it is drawing the heat away from the body, since the blood close to the surface of the skin, the blood vessels close to the surface of the skin are dilated. It's exposing more blood to the surface area where the skin is cooled, and this helps to return the body to its normal set point temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. Now, we were talking about when the body temperature rose above normal. This is called hyperthermia. Let's talk a little bit about hypothermia. This is the stimulus which sends the temperature dropping below normal, or it drops below normal. You have receptors, thermoreceptors, that send this information to the brain, or the control center, the hypothalamus. It detects the deviation of set point and signals the effector organs. Well, you have a couple of things happen when you have hypothermia. The skin blood vessels constrict, and the sweat glands remain inactive. It goes a little bit of a step further in that the blood in the body will be shunted away from the extremities, the arms, legs, hands, and feet, so that it can keep the core temperature at a constant, so it would protect your organs. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, a second thing that can happen is that the muscles will contract involuntarily, and anytime muscles do work, heat is produced, and this helps to warm the body, and the body heat is conserved, temperature rises toward normal, and we go back to set point. All this is as a result of negative feedback. Let's continue with Chapter 1 with organization of the body. The body can be divided into the axial and appendicular portion. The axial portion includes the head, neck, and trunk, and the appendicular portion includes the upper and lower limbs. We're going to concern ourselves with the axial portion because it contains the body cavities. And the body cavity is a space that contains organs called viscera. Now, you've probably heard of viscera before, or maybe a form of the word when you watch CSI. If you're a CSI fan and one of the investigators finds an eviscerated body, it means that the organs have been removed. Now let's look at the body cavities. In the area where you have the brain is the cranial cavity. Where you have the vertebrae, the spinal cord is the vertebral canal. It's located on the dorsal side of the body. On the ventral side of the body, you have the thoracic cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity and the thoracic cavity are separated by the membrane known as the diaphragm below the lungs. And here is the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity holds the heart and the lungs. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, you have the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. In the abdominal cavity, you have the stomach, liver, and spleen, gallbladder, kidneys, and most of the small and large intestines. In the pelvic cavity, you have a portion of the intestines. It is enclosed by the hip bones. It contains the urinary bladder and the internal reproductive organs. The thoracic cavity, you have the pleural cavities. Pleura means lungs, and the pleural cavities contain the lungs. Mediastinum is the heart, where the heart is found, and the heart is located in the pericardial cavity. You have the thymus, part of the esophagus, part of the trachea, and blood vessels found in the mediastinum. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, again, the stomach, liver, spleen, and small intestines. In the pelvic cavity, in the area enclosed by the hips or the pelvis, is the urinary bladder, internal reproductive organ, part of the colon, and the rectum. Again, these two cavities are separated by the diaphragm. Small cavities in the head, you have an oral cavity, nasal cavities that are around the nasal cavity. You have sinuses, middle ear cavities, and orbital cavities. The orbit contains the eye. Let's talk about membranes. Now, we said viscera means organs, so the visceral layer covers an organ. The parietal layer covers a cavity or body wall. In the thoracic cavity, the thoracic membranes would be the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. Now, we said that the pleura has to do with the lungs. So if the membrane is directly on the surface of the lung, we call it the visceral pleura. If it is lining the thoracic cavity or the pleural cavity, it is called the parietal pleura. Now, directly on the surface of the heart would be the visceral pericardium, and lining the cavity that holds the heart would be the parietal pericardium. In the abdominal pelvic membranes, it's a little more easy. All of the abdominal pelvic membranes, all of the organs are lined with visceral peritoneum. The abdominal pelvic cavity is lined by the parietal peritoneum. Again, Parietal layer lines the cavity or body wall. Visceral layer covers an organ. Now in this picture, if you look closely, this picture is found in your textbook also. If you look closely, here's your heart, and there is the pericardial cavity that contains the heart, and there's the visceral pericardium. That is the layer of tissue that covers the heart. The parietal pericardium lines the pericardial cavity. Here is the right lung. The viscera pleura would line the right lung, the pleural cavity, and the parietal pleura lines that cavity. Now these are called serous membranes. Serous membranes produce a fluid called serous fluid. It's epithelial tissue that produces a fluid. This fluid helps to nourish the surrounding tissues, and it also acts as a cushion between the wall of that cavity and the organ itself. Now in continuing chapter 1, let's look at the organ systems. The body covering is the largest organ in the body. It is the integumentary system. It includes the skin and the associated organs. Then you have support and movement, the skeletal system, ligaments, cartilage, bones. These all help act as protective shields and frameworks, the softer tissues and attachments for muscles, and act with muscles to help the body move. Muscular system, the nervous system. It includes the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, and sense organs. They communicate with each other and send signals through with neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters exerts relative short-term effect, but these are chemicals released by the nervous system. The endocrine system has glands that secrete chemical messengers called hormones, and these hormones act on target cells to cause a change. Then you have the cardiovascular system. It includes the heart, arteries, veins, capillaries, and the blood. The lymphatic system is very similar to the cardiovascular system. You have the lymph vessels, lymph nodes, the thymus, spleen, and the fluid that's circulated is called lymph. The digestive system. The digestive system helps to break down larger molecules, substances into smaller, usable ones. Respiratory system. The respiratory system moves air in and out of the lungs, and it exchanges gases between the blood and the air. The oxygen passes from the air into the lungs and into the blood, and carbon dioxide leaves the blood and enters the air. You have the nasal cavities, the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs as part of this system. Then the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. Now let's talk about anatomical terminology. The correct anatomical position would be the body standing erect, facing forward, upper limbs at the sides, palms facing outward. Terms of relative position. Now, relative position means that you are comparing one to another position. Okay? Superior means that the body part is above another part. Again, relative position. You're comparing one part to the other. The example would be the thoracic cavity is superior to the abdominopelvic cavity. The elbow is superior to the wrist. Anterior versus posterior. Anterior would be the front half of the body as opposed to the back half of the body, posterior. The pharynx is posterior to the oral cavity. The eyes are anterior to the brain. Medial versus lateral. When you think of medial, think of like the midline to the body versus going out toward the sides. Imaginary midline, dividing the body into equal right and left halves. The body part is medial if it's closer to the midline than the other. And an example would be the nose is medial to the eyes. Lateral means that you're going toward the sides, away from the midline. The ears are lateral to the eyes. Ipsilateral and contralateral. A controversy would be a position of two people on opposite sides. Contralateral opposites of one another. Ipsilateral on the same side. It refers to structures on the same side. The right lung and the right kidney are ipsilateral. Contralateral example would be a fractured bone in the right leg would have to bear weight on the left leg, as an example that your book gives you. Contralateral, the two kidneys are contralateral to one another. Proximal, again, it's closer to the point of attachment and to the trunk than another body part. The elbow is proximal to the wrist. The shoulder is proximal to the elbow. Distal is the opposite of proximal. It means that a particular body part is further away from a point of attachment to the trunk than another part is, a distance away. So a distal, the wrist would be distal to the elbow. The elbow would be distal to the shoulder. The shoulder would be proximal to the elbow. So practice using these terms. Superior versus deep. Superior would be closer to the surface as opposed to deep. The epidermis is the superficial layer of the skin. The dermis is the deep layer of the skin. Body sections are plane, sagittal, mid-sagittal, or median. Divides the body into right and left halves. So here's a sagittal. Then you have a transverse or horizontal. The superior and the inferior divides the body into the upper and lower, basically. Coronal plane. Coronal means crown. It separates the body into the anterior or posterior halves, or the ventral versus the dorsal. There's a sagittal cut and transverse or horizontal, and then coronal. Abdominal subdivisions. Quadrants divide the abdominal pelvic cavity into right upper quadrant and left upper quadrant. You see the spleen right under the liver here. The spleen is in the right upper quadrant. Most of the stomach is in the left upper quadrant. The liver will pass through both of these quadrants. The appendix, found right here, is in the right lower quadrant, so symptoms of appendicitis may be pain in the right lower quadrant, along with fever and nausea and stuff like that. The left lower quadrant is this area. A bladder infection may cause pain that radiates from the right to the left lower quadrant. This is the end of Chapter 1.